I still remember the way she said it, like she was talking about weekend plans, not detonating our marriage.
I volunteered to be a surrogate for Mason and his wife.
The words hit me halfway through a bite. I lifted the fork to my mouth, then slowly set it down, looking at her and waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. She was serious, completely serious. Mason, her college ex, the one she still followed on social media like a ghost she couldn't exorcise. I set my fork aside, heart steady but eyes cold. She smiled, expecting approval, maybe applause. The kitchen light flickered against her glass of water, as if even the room rejected her logic.
They can't have kids,
She said, soft and noble, like a saint delivering salvation. I nodded slowly, measuring the silence between us. That was the moment something inside me froze. She kept talking as if nothing had cracked open between us. Words poured out in a steady, self-satisfied rhythm, how Mason's wife had cried over coffee, how she felt called to help, how it's just biology, not emotion. I barely heard her. The kitchen clock ticked louder than her voice, every second slicing through the air. "You met with them?" I asked finally. 2 weeks ago," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It felt right. 2 weeks. She'd planned all this while I sat across from her every night, sharing meals, sharing silence. My fork still rested on the plate, untouched. "You didn't think to tell me before agreeing to carry another man's child?" I asked. She tilted her head, frowning as if I'd missed the point entirely. "It's not his child. It's their child," she corrected, her tone soft but sharp enough to draw blood. Outside, a storm was gathering small drops, clicking against the window pane, the kind that builds before thunder breaks. I stared at her glass of water again, watching the faint tremor ripple across its surface. "And the clinic?" I said. "When is this happening?" "Next Monday," she replied, almost cheerfully. "They've already scheduled everything. Isn't it amazing how quickly things fall into place when it's meant to be?" That word meant hung between us like smoke. I could have argued, shouted, begged for reason. Instead, I just nodded again, the same slow movement as before. But this time it wasn't confusion. It was confirmation. The woman in front of me wasn't the same person I married. She was a stranger wearing her face, talking about miracles while dismantling our lives piece by piece. That night, I sat in the darkened living room long after she'd gone upstairs. Rain tapped against the windows like a metronome, steady and deliberate. The house felt heavier somehow, as if the walls had started keeping secrets too. On the coffee table, her phone buzzed twice, Mason's name glowing across the screen before fading. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Everything I needed to know was already clear. I opened my laptop, the glow washing over the empty room, and began typing "family law attorney" near me. My hands were calm, methodical. Years in project management had trained me to think in contingencies, timelines, outcomes, leverage. This was no different, just more personal. I took notes on asset division, insurance policy terms, and legal grounds for unilateral decisions. By the time the clock read 2:17 a.m., I had a plan forming like architecture in my mind, clean, precise, irreversible. Upstairs, I heard her footsteps, restless pacing, maybe a phone call muffled behind the bedroom door. I caught fragments. The transfer date. So excited. He's supportive. I almost laughed. Supportive. That's what she called silence these days. In the morning, she brewed coffee like nothing had happened. She hummed to herself while scrolling through an article about the emotional beauty of surrogacy. I watched her, memorizing the way she smiled at her phone, not at me. That's when the detachment became total. The emotional circuits disconnected. The man sitting at that table wasn't her husband anymore. He was the architect of an exit. I left for work early, but instead of heading to the office, I parked 2 blocks away from a downtown law firm. I sat in the car for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, rain streaking the windshield. One thought settled, heavy and final. She'd made her choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The law firm was tucked between a pawn shop and an insurance office, the kind of place that didn't waste money on appearances. The glass door read Carlton and Avery, Family Law, the paint on the letters fading at the edges. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper, rain, and something older like endings that had been signed, sealed, and forgotten. A receptionist looked up from her desk. "You have an appointment?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, "with Mr. Avery." He met me 10 minutes later. Mid-50s, gray suit, eyes that had seen every kind of human implosion. His handshake was firm, not friendly. "You mentioned this was time-sensitive." I nodded. "My wife volunteered to be a surrogate for her ex-boyfriend and his wife, without telling me. The procedure's scheduled for next week." He stopped writing. "Without spousal consent?" Without a single word. He leaned back, studying me. "And you want to file before the transfer?" "Before she walks into that clinic," I said. "I want the paperwork filed, the accounts frozen, and her removed from my insurance. I don't want to finance her betrayal." He exhaled through his nose, not surprised but quietly impressed. "All right," he said. "Then we move fast." He began listing what he'd need: financial statements, joint account details, insurance documents, and lease agreements. I provided everything from memory, my mind cataloging like it always did, structured, calm. He scribbled notes as I spoke. "You're remarkably composed," he said finally. "That's the only way to win," I replied. By the time I left his office, the rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened like wet glass. I grabbed a coffee across the street, sat by the window, and watched people hurry past under umbrellas. No one would have guessed I'd just rewritten the course of my life, between 2 cups of caffeine and a legal pad. When I got home, she was sitting on the couch, laptop open, reading articles about prenatal nutrition. "How was work?" she asked, smiling absently. "Productive," I said, and it was just not in the way she imagined. Later that night, I scanned documents, emailed forms to Mr. Avery, and locked our joint accounts online. My pulse didn't rise once. I was detached, surgical. She came into the office doorway wearing a robe, holding a mug of chamomile tea. "You've been quiet lately," she said softly. "Everything okay?" I looked at her for a long moment, the woman I once loved but couldn't recognize anymore. "Everything's fine," I said, returning my eyes to the screen. And for the first time in weeks, I meant it. By Friday, Mr. Avery called. "Everything's ready. The filings go out Monday morning." Monday, the same day, she'd scheduled the embryo transfer. I almost smiled. Perfect symmetry. The kind the universe rarely offers, but when it does, you take it. The weekend arrived, cloaked in calm, the kind that makes people believe everything is fine right before the ground gives way. Emma was humming again, always humming now, floating through the house like someone rehearsing joy. I watched her pack vitamins into a small pill organizer and label a folder, Procedure Day. She was methodical, almost proud, her hand steady as if she were assembling a gift. "Mason's dropping off the hormone injections this afternoon," she said. "They need to stay refrigerated." She said it like she was announcing a delivery from Amazon, not a transaction that would redefine everything between us. I nodded, the same way I had all week. Each gesture of silence now was deliberate, measured, a steady hand tightening the screws. Inside, every hour felt like a countdown. I'd already triple-checked the filings with Mr. Avery, confirmed the account freezes, and even updated my HR portal to process the insurance removal. The machine was in motion, and there was no going back. That afternoon, Mason arrived. I heard his car before I saw it, engine too confident, music too loud for a rainy Saturday. He knocked once, then let himself in after she called, "It's open." I stayed in the living room, laptop on, pretending to work. He entered carrying a small insulated bag, grinning like a man who still believed he was welcome here. "Hey man," he said, casual, friendly, unaware. "Appreciate you being so understanding about all this." Understanding. That word nearly made me laugh. "Of course," I said evenly, my eyes never leaving the screen. I could feel his gaze searching for a reaction, something to prove his moral superiority. He found none. In the kitchen, they laughed light, familiar, too comfortable. The kind of laughter that doesn't belong between married people and their exes. I heard the clink of glass, her soft gasp, as he demonstrated how to prepare the injection pen, his voice low and instructive. The intimacy of instruction. A man is guiding my wife on how to alter her body for him. It took everything in me to stay still. When he finally left, I walked into the kitchen. The cooler sat on the counter like a trophy. "Got everything you need?" I asked. "Yes," she said brightly. "First shot tomorrow morning." She kissed my cheek before heading upstairs. Her lips were warm, her tone light. Mine stayed still. Sunday came gray and quiet. I watched her stand in the bathroom mirror, sterilizing her skin, pinching the small fold of flesh near her hip. "Want to help?" she asked. I shook my head. She smiled anyway, whispering something about miracles in progress. The needle sank in. She flinched slightly, then smiled at her reflection as if pain were proof of virtue. I made coffee. By that evening, she was radiant, full of purpose, glowing with borrowed significance. She talked about Mason's wife, about how grateful she sounded on the phone. She said she cried when she found out I was doing this for them, Emma said, her voice soft and dreamy. "It feels so good to help people like that." I looked at her and thought how strange it was the way people can destroy their own lives while believing they're saving someone else's. "I'm sure it does," I said. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had returned, brushing against the windows like a steady whisper. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching her breathe in the dim light, peaceful, untouched by consequence. On the nightstand was her open notebook, filled with lists. Clinic forms, transfer date, recovery plan. Every box checked, every decision made without me. I closed it gently, then stood and walked to my office. The glow from my monitor painted the walls in blue. I opened Avery's email again, rereading every line. Filing confirmed, accounts locked. Insurance processed effective Monday, 9 a.m. At dawn, she woke before me. "Big day," she whispered, excitement spilling into the air like perfume. She showered, dressed in soft gray sweats, and pulled her hair into a ponytail. I made coffee, the sound of the machine grounding me in the absurdity of it all. She grabbed her keys, kissed my forehead, and said, "Wish me luck." "I do," I said quietly. Her car disappeared down the street, taillights bleeding into the mist. I stood there, cup in hand, listening to the silence she left behind. It wasn't grief, I felt it was completion. The storm outside had stopped, but inside, the pressure was perfect. Everything was in place. At exactly 9:03, my phone buzzed. Avery's message, "All filings executed. Insurance removal confirmed." I exhaled, long and steady. The symmetry was complete. She was in a clinic, carrying another man's future, while legally, ours was ending. By noon, her messages started coming in short at first, then frantic. I didn't read them. I didn't have to. Every vibration of my phone was the echo of her realization, the sound of truth finally catching up. When I got home that evening, her car was already in the driveway. The front door stood half open. Inside, she was at the kitchen table, hands shaking, papers scattered before her. "What is this?" she asked, voice breaking. I looked at her, calm, deliberate. "That," I said, "is reality catching up." The room fell silent, except for the steady ticking of the wall clock each second, marking the end of something she thought she controlled. She stared at me, clutching the papers like they might dissolve if she let go. Her breath came shallow, uneven. "You filed for divorce?" she whispered. "Without even talking to me?" I leaned against the counter, calm as ever. "You didn't talk to me before volunteering your body for another man's child," I said. "We're even." Her lips trembled, but she wasn't crying, she was processing, just as I had days before. "You can't do this," she said, shaking her head. "You can't just—" "I already did," I interrupted. The words landed between us like a door slamming shut. She backed up, gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "The accounts," she whispered. "They're frozen." "Correct. My insurance?" "Removed this morning," I said, and took a slow sip of water. The quiet sound of glass meeting the counter filled the space where her denial crumbled. Then came the panic, the wild pacing, the phone snatched from the table, the frantic tapping of keys. "I'll fix this. I'll call Mason. We'll figure it out." "Mason," I repeated, my voice low but steady. "Maybe he can pay for what you started." Her head snapped toward me, eyes wide, something between guilt and fury flashing across her face. "You're doing this to punish me." "No," I said. "I'm doing this to protect myself." She called the clinic. I stood there while she explained through tears that her insurance had been canceled mid-procedure. The nurse must have said something coldly procedural because she broke then, sinking into the chair, shoulders shaking. "They said I'll have to pay out of pocket," she whispered. "I'm sure Mason will be happy to help," I said, picking up my keys. She looked up at me then, her voice barely a breath. "You waited until today on purpose." "I waited," I said, "until it mattered." When I walked out, her phone started ringing again. Mason, probably. The sound followed me down the hall like an alarm no one could silence. I drove aimlessly for a while, through rain-slick streets that shimmered under streetlights, thinking about symmetry. She was at the clinic when I ended the marriage. Poetic, in a way. A trade of sorts. She gave herself to someone else's future, and I gave her back her freedom without the safety net she thought she could take for granted. When I returned later that night, the house was silent again. Her phone lay on the floor, cracked. The papers were gone from the table, folded neatly beside a cold mug of tea. Upstairs, the door to our bedroom was closed, a faint line of light glowing beneath it. For a moment, I stood there, listening. The faint sound of her crying bled through the wood. I didn't move. There was nothing left to say. Downstairs, I poured a drink, turned on the television, and let the noise drown her out. The storm outside had passed, but in its wake, everything stood washed and bare, like the truth finally had room to breathe. It didn't take long for the fallout to find me. Peace, as I quickly learned, never lasts when other people are committed to rewriting the story. 2 days after Emma left, the first headline appeared online. "Local woman betrayed by husband amid surrogacy scandal." A grainy photo of her from last year smiling at a charity event was plastered across the article. The story was full of half-truths and selective sympathy. She was portrayed as a martyr, a selfless woman punished for helping a couple conceive. My name was mentioned only once, but the implication was clear. A cold, vindictive husband destroys his wife's act of kindness. I closed the article halfway through. Not out of anger. Anger had long passed, but because the words felt like static. None of it was real anymore, just noise echoing through the empty space she left behind. Then came the messages. Old friends, co-workers, even distant relatives are reaching out to check in. Some were subtle. "Hey man, rough week? Hang in there." Others were blunt. "How could you do that to her?" It was remarkable how quickly people chose sides when they only knew half the story. By Friday, Emma's social media posts had turned full-tilt performative. Photos of hospital wristbands, vague captions about resilience, and her favorite, "Sometimes doing what's right means standing alone." Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. She'd learned that victimhood plays well online. Mason and Lily liked every post. What she didn't expect was the other side of the internet, the one that doesn't stop digging once it smells blood. Someone found the surrogacy law in our state, the part that made any agreement invalid without spousal consent. Screenshots spread fast. Wait, this means her husband didn't agree? So technically she broke the law? The comment section shifted overnight from sympathy to confusion, then skepticism. I didn't feed it. I didn't comment, didn't defend myself. The truth, I'd learned, has a strange way of surfacing when you stop pushing. Meanwhile, Mason's legal team kept trying to salvage their disaster. They'd invested close to $70,000 in medical and legal fees, and they weren't about to accept the loss quietly. Avery received a formal letter alleging intentional interference with contractual obligations. It was laughable if I hadn't signed. There was no contract to interfere with. Avery filed a response so sharp it could have drawn blood. A week later, a process server handed me a new envelope. Emma's attorney, a woman named Marlowe, was filing for temporary spousal support, citing emotional duress and medical hardship. It was an obvious play for pity before the court date. Avery read it, sighed, and slid it across his desk. "Classic optics," he said. "Don't worry, the judge won't buy it." But optics, those were Emma's specialty. She'd built a narrative so neatly that even her lies had structure. On paper, she was a pregnant, abandoned wife, while I was the cold strategist with frozen accounts and a legal hammer. The truth didn't matter yet. Not until the courtroom. Still, I underestimated her flair for chaos. That weekend, a local morning show ran a short feature, The Compassionate Surrogate Under Fire. I watched the segment on mute. Her voice was soft, tremulous, every word rehearsed. "I just wanted to help a family who couldn't have children. I never thought I'd be punished for having a kind heart." Punished. The word lingered. Not consequences, not choices. Punished, Avery called that afternoon. "They're trying to sway public opinion before the hearing. Don't engage, Gavin. The judge will see through it." "I'm not worried about the judge," I said. "I'm worried about the noise." He chuckled dryly. "Noise fades, paper doesn't." He was right. Paper remembers. In the days leading up to the hearing, Mason's lawyers tried one last tactic: mediation. They offered a settlement if I'd sign a retroactive consent form, legitimizing the surrogacy after the fact. "It'll clean this up for everyone," Mason said on the call. "You can still come out looking decent." "Decent?" I repeated. "You impregnated my wife with your embryo and think decency's still on the table?" He went silent. Then quietly, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." No, I thought. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. When the court date finally came, the courthouse lobby buzzed with tension. Reporters lingered near the steps, microphones ready, cameras rolling. Emma arrived, flanked by her attorney and her mother, dressed in soft colors like a penitent saint. Mason and Lily kept their distance, but their lawyer, Huxley, stood beside them, all confidence and polished contempt. Avery met me inside, calm as ever, a portfolio under one arm. "Remember," he said, "we're not here to fight feelings, we're here to show facts." The courtroom itself felt colder than usual, too bright, too sterile, like truth had a specific temperature. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Emma avoided my eyes, her hands folded neatly on the table. Marlowe opened with practiced sincerity. "Your Honor, my client stands before you as a woman who acted out of compassion. She never sought to deceive, only to help." The judge nodded, letting her continue. Her husband's actions, filing for divorce mid-procedure, cutting her off financially, reflect cruelty and calculated emotional abuse. Avery didn't flinch. When his turn came, he stood with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, my client did nothing unlawful. The surrogacy agreement is void under state law. Mrs. Rains," he gestured toward Emma, "entered into a binding medical arrangement without her spouse's consent, an act that is, in itself, a breach of marital and legal duty." Marlowe interjected. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge said. Avery continued, his tone measured but lethal. "The moment Mrs. Rains chose to exclude her husband from a life-altering decision, she dissolved the foundation of that marriage. The subsequent financial measures were not revenge. They were protection." Across the room, Emma's composure cracked. She whispered something to Marlowe, who nodded and requested a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. Outside, in the hallway, the air felt electric. Mason stood near the window, talking to Huxley. I caught fragments, words like damages, reputation, liability. Lily stood apart, arms crossed, face pale. When she saw me, she looked away. Guilt, maybe, or shame. Hard to tell. Emma walked past me toward the restroom. Eyes glassy, lips pressed tight. She didn't speak, but I could tell from her expression that the weight of the room was starting to crush her performance. When the recess ended, we returned. The judge's tone had shifted firmer, more direct. "Mrs. Rains," she said, "did you consult your husband before agreeing to this surrogacy arrangement?" "No, Your Honor," Emma said softly. "And were you aware that spousal consent is required by law in this state for any gestational agreement?" Emma hesitated. Marlowe leaned forward, whispering something, but the judge cut her off. "Answer the question, please." "I was aware," Emma whispered. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the court reporter paused mid-stroke. The judge sighed, leaned back, and folded her hands. "Then I see no grounds for your claim of abandonment or cruelty." Mr. Rains acted within his legal rights to protect shared assets and ensure compliance with the law. The court will not entertain damages derived from a contract that was invalid from inception. The gavel's sound hadn't fully faded when the room seemed to shrink around us. For a long, suspended second, no one breathed. Emma's face had gone pale, her lips trembling slightly, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She sat there frozen, caught between disbelief and the realization that the story she'd built so carefully had just been dismantled, brick by brick, in front of everyone. The judge's words still hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, invalid from inception. There was something almost poetic in it. A mirror held up to everything she'd done, every lie wrapped in virtue, every decision she'd justified as helping. Marlowe tried to salvage dignity. She stood, gathering papers with a deliberate calm meant to hide the sting of defeat, but her eyes betrayed her sharp, calculating, angry. I'd seen that look before. In corporate boardrooms, when someone realized their negotiation leverage had vanished mid-sentence. Across the aisle, Mason leaned toward Huxley, his expression tight and colorless. Lily sat beside him, her hand gripping her purse as though it were armor. When the judge dismissed the court, neither of them moved immediately. Mason's jaw flexed like he was chewing down something bitter. I could almost hear the calculation in his silence, what this meant for their reputation, their money, their marriage. Emma stood finally, slow and unsteady. She didn't look at me, not right away. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the judge's bench, empty now but still commanding. Then, quietly, she said something to Marlowe that I couldn't hear. Marlowe nodded once, gathered the last of her files, and exited briskly. Emma remained. I rose from my seat, buttoned my jacket, and started for the door. As I passed her table, she spoke without looking up. "You wanted to humiliate me." I stopped. "No," I said. "You did that yourself." Her head lifted slowly. For the first time, her composure cracked completely. The woman who'd stood before cameras and journalists, who'd curated sympathy like a brand, she was gone. What remained was just Emma. Human, fallible, exhausted. "You don't understand," she said. "I was trying to do something good." "Good," I repeated softly. "You built a lie and called it good because it made you feel needed. But real good, real integrity doesn't need an audience." The silence between us stretched. Then she said it, the last gasp of denial. "I didn't think it would end like this." "It never does," I said. I walked past her and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder out there, the fluorescent lights harsher. Avery joined me a moment later, his expression unreadable. "That's it," he said simply. "She has no claim left. You're clear." Clear. The word didn't feel like victory. It felt like the closing of a door. Outside the courthouse, the press had already gathered. Reporters swarmed the steps, their questions sharp and eager. "Mr. Rains, do you have a statement? Do you regret your actions toward your wife? Did you know about the surrogacy before she went public?" I kept walking, eyes forward, the shuffle of cameras following like a swarm of mechanical insects. Avery blocked most of the path, giving them the polite lawyer's brush-off. But I could still hear the flashbulbs popping like gunfire. Behind me, I heard another wave of commotion. Emma had emerged, flanked by her mother and a visibly shaken Marlowe. The reporters pivoted instantly, drawn to the easier story, the fallen angel, the woman with tears in her eyes and tragedy on her lips. She stopped halfway down the stairs, gave a brief statement about hoping for understanding, and then, in the most revealing moment of all, she added, "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to do the right thing." It was almost impressive how instinctively she performed. Even stripped of legal ground, she clung to perception. But this time, the crowd's reaction wasn't unanimous. A few murmurs, some skeptical faces. The illusion was cracking in public now, not just in court. Avery nudged my shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "You don't need to watch this." But I did. Not out of spite, out of closure. I watched her finish her little speech, watched Mason and Lily slip quietly into a waiting car without acknowledging her. I watched the cameras lose interest once the sound bites were done. And when she finally turned to look my way, the recognition in her eyes wasn't of me, it was of consequence. As we walked toward the parking lot, Avery exhaled, almost smiling. "You handled yourself well in there." "I didn't do much," I said. "The truth did the work." He nodded. "That's the thing about truth, it doesn't argue. It just waits." In the car, I sat in silence for a while before starting the engine. Across the street, the courthouse loomed gray, solemn, final. I thought about everything that had led here. A dinner, a sentence, a decision she never thought I'd challenge. And then, almost involuntarily, I laughed once. Quietly, but genuinely. Because for the first time in months, I realized something simple, something freeing. The moment she'd chosen to carry another man's child without asking me, she'd been certain she held all the power. But power built on assumption always collapses when confronted with truth. The courtroom hadn't just ruled in my favor, it had drawn a line between illusion and accountability. In the weeks that followed, the dust didn't settle, it scattered. Truth doesn't end stories, it rearranges them. And what it left behind for Emma was a kind of silence that even sympathy couldn't fill. The first I heard of Mason's lawsuit was through Avery. He called one morning, voice even but edged with something close to disbelief. "He's suing her," he said. "Breach of contract. Claims she violated the surrogacy agreement, missed appointments, and refused medical updates." I almost laughed. So the savior gets sued by the man she was saving? Avery didn't answer immediately. "Poetic," he said finally. The papers hit the headlines before she did. Surrogacy deal implodes. Former surrogate sued by couple she tried to help. No warm lighting this time. No curated photo of empathy. Just a mugshot from a courthouse parking lot, eyes red, makeup smudged, exhaustion written into every line of her face. The internet turned on her overnight. The same audience that had called her brave now called her reckless. Hypocrite. Homewrecker. Mason, ever the opportunist, leaned into the lawsuit with the precision of a man restoring his reputation. His PR team released a statement about emotional distress and significant financial harm. Lily stayed silent, her name conspicuously missing from every quote. From what I heard, their marriage was fraying too. Lawsuits have a way of revealing who's standing for truth and who's just standing for optics. As for Emma, she tried to disappear, deleted her social media, moved out of her parents' house. Word got around that she'd been fired from her job at the nonprofit. The board didn't want the controversy. Former friends stopped answering her calls. Even her mother, who'd once called me cruel, reached out to Avery's office, apparently asking if the court could reduce the spousal support to cover legal debts. Avery forwarded me the voicemail. "Looks like compassion runs in the family," he said. Every so often, I'd hear fragments. She'd been seen at a clinic out of town. She was renting a small place alone. The pregnancy had been carried to term, but the couple refused contact. If true, she'd given everything, her body, her image, her dignity, and ended up with nothing but debt and silence. There were moments when people asked if I felt sorry for her. I told them the truth. Empathy and accountability aren't enemies, but they can't coexist when one side refuses to learn. She didn't need my pity. She needed her consequences. One evening, months later, I passed by a cafe near the courthouse and saw her through the window, alone at a corner table, stirring a cup that had long gone cold. No makeup, no armor, just a woman who finally looked like herself. For a brief moment, our eyes met through the glass. Neither of us moved. Then she looked away, and I walked on. Back home, I poured a drink and sat by the same window that had witnessed everything. The unraveling, the silence, the rebuild. The streetlights flickered on, soft and even, casting gold across the quiet room. I thought about power and how fragile it really is when built on lies. I thought about how easy it is to mistake control for strength and silence for surrender. In the end, justice didn't roar, it whispered. It arrived not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the stillness afterward, when the truth finally stood alone. Sometimes, I still think about that night, the sound of her voice in the kitchen, calm and oblivious, telling me she'd volunteered to carry Mason's child. It plays back like a film I've already seen too many times, except now I know exactly where the plot breaks. That moment wasn't just the beginning of betrayal, it was the moment I learned what silence is worth. In the aftermath of everything, lawsuits, headlines, courtroom echoes, people kept asking what lesson I took from it. But lessons aren't always clean. Sometimes they come wrapped in wreckage. What I learned wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about boundaries, how the failure to defend them can destroy you just as easily as crossing them can destroy others. Emma's downfall didn't bring me joy. It brought perspective. She thought autonomy meant acting without consequence. I learned that real autonomy means accepting them. The difference between us was simple. I built from awareness. She built from impulse. And structures built on impulse always collapse. These days, my life is quieter. I go to work, keep to my routines, and see people who don't need spectacles to feel alive. I've rebuilt not just my circumstances, but my sense of peace. It's strange how peace feels heavier than victory. Maybe because it demands something harder than fighting. It demands letting go. Every now and then, when someone asks if I'd ever take her back, I smile faintly and tell them no, not out of bitterness, but clarity. Some doors close because they're meant to. Some endings don't ask for applause. They just need acknowledgement. If there's a moral to all this, it's not grand or cinematic. It's quiet, like truth always is. Love without respect isn't love, it's dependency dressed in sentiment. And when someone shows you they don't value your voice, you don't argue for a seat at their table, you build your own. That's what I did, and I've never looked back.